Hello. In this video, I'll talk about the way woke psychotherapy is practiced. Over the course of over 70 videos, I've talked about how woke psychotherapy is informed by critical social justice theory and postmodernism. Today, I want to get to the nuts and bolts of woke psychotherapy praxis, how it's done, how it's actually done. My name is Michael Dwan Herrick. I'm a psychotherapist and a life coach with 45 years of experience. Currently, I'm in private practice in London. In addition to creating content relevant to personal development, I've also created a playlist under the title Questioning Woke Psychotherapy. This video falls into that category. To understand woke praxis, it's helpful to know something about the theory or ideology it is based on. I've covered this extensively in past videos, but for the purpose of this video, I'll keep it very brief. It boils down to this. As informed by critical social justice, woke psychotherapy categorizes people according to their group identities. These different groups of people are further categorized by their positions in hierarchies of power. There are those with social privilege who are considered oppressors, whether they know and intend it or not. And there are those who are marginalized, discriminated against, and oppressed, again, whether they know it or not. The categorization of people into one of these two groups is the foundation stone that informs and supports woke practice, wherever it goes, including psychotherapy. There are several categories of group identity that are considered oppressed. The concept of intersectionality considers the degree of oppression an individual experiences by the number of oppressed identities that person has. Race, sexuality, and gender are the identities that woke primarily focuses on and is concerned about. The main difference between the theory and praxis of woke psychotherapy and traditional models is this. Traditional models are based on healing clients, whether working with individuals, couples, families, or groups. Woke psychotherapy is based on social activism. Its aim is social change. While these different intentions can overlap, my contention is that a therapist's primary intention should be healing, not activism. I'll shortly be talking about how woke psychotherapy is practiced, but first a few acknowledgments. No matter what theory or practice model orients any version of psychotherapy, therapists are not made with a cookie cutter. There are differences between different kinds of therapy, such as traditional and woke, but also within each kind. For instance, there are different ways to teach and practice psychoanalysis or CBT, and it is no different for woke psychotherapy. Different training programs, even if they all emphasize critical social justice and activism, will emphasize different things. And graduates of the same program will practice in their own unique individual way. So up front, I'm acknowledging that it is impossible for me to say in a definitive way exactly and uniformly what the practice of woke psychotherapy looks like. What I can do is identify a general common praxis that guides therapists informed by critical social justice theory. It has a name. It's called critical pedagogy. This is rarely declared explicitly. Having read training materials and accounts from trainees, as well as spoken directly to many students, it's clear to me that critical pedagogy is informing what is being taught about how to practice activism within psychotherapy. In 1968, Brazilian educator and philosopher Paulo Freire published his book, Pedagogy for the Oppressed. As a Marxist, he advocated for education as a tool for liberation, especially of economically marginalized populations. The term critical pedagogy emerged later as a broader framework inspired by Freire's ideas. The praxis of critical pedagogy, which I will unpack in a moment, has been widely impactful in the training of educators worldwide. Although Freire's book was published in English in 1970, it wasn't until 1985 that American-Canadian scholar and cultural critic Henry Giroux, along with others, managed to persuade the colleges of education to adopt it. From there, it trickled down to all educational programs. Different programs give it different emphasis, but nearly all included in their curriculums. Wherever social emotional learning is included in public education, critical pedagogy is present. Its influence is so pervasive that those who practice it don't always even know that that's what they're doing. My interest in this video is in how the praxis of critical pedagogy has been brought to the practice of psychotherapy. But to have an impact on therapy, it must first have an impact on the training of psychotherapists. Just as it has found its way into public education through SEL, social emotional learning, it has found its way into psychotherapy training programs through courses on cultural competence, diversity, and social justice. Whether it has found its way into public education or psychotherapy training, once in, it tends to bleed out into other curriculums. I know that where I taught a course on diversity in a therapy training program in London, after a couple years there was much talk about how diversity should not be contained in a single course, but should be an element of every course. So, what I have to say about the praxis of woke psychotherapy should also be understood as how psychotherapy is taught. In therapy, it is practiced by therapists with their clients, and in training, it is practiced by educators with their students. Critical pedagogy has become a vast and complex field, and I can't address all of it. Another acknowledgement I want to make is that it is not entirely without merit. I think many of its ideas are useful and make a meaningful contribution to education, and they could also contribute to psychotherapy. I see no reason why education can't impart knowledge and skills needed to function in and contribute to society, while also teaching students to question and critique that society and contribute to improving it. I also see no reason that therapists can't help their clients to take responsibility for the quality of their lives, while also acknowledging the social context and its impact on that client's life. The main problem, and it's a big one, occurs when critical pedagogy eclipses the fundamental purpose of either education or psychotherapy and replaces it with its own political ideology and agenda. If you like this video, please remember to give it a like, and if you aren't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. I'm trying to grow this channel, and your support will be greatly appreciated. Thank you. Okay, let's get down to it. Critical pedagogy is a method or practice aimed at raising critical consciousness for the purpose of recruiting activists for revolution. Critical consciousness is the awareness of how one is being oppressed and by who. There are many steps and components to this methods. I will focus on the most essential and commonly practiced. This is for the purpose of brevity, as much as trying to be as accurate as I can about the practice of woke psychotherapy and say what I think most woke psychotherapists do. I'll start with the initial consultation and assessment and describe the methods that unfold from there to the end goal of recruiting a client as a social justice activist. There are two parallel paths for this. One is for the marginalized and oppressed client, and the other is for the privileged and oppressing client. For this video, I'll focus on the first to avoid the video being too long. Perhaps I'll talk about the privileged client in a follow-up video. Let's imagine the client is a 36-year-old Black woman named Shanice. Shanice is a nurse, recently married, experiencing work-related stress, conflict with her husband, frustrations in her career advancement, and an ongoing low mood. In an initial meeting, a woke assessment might be very similar to any other kind of therapy. It would likely include gathering Shanice's biopsychosocial history and identifying her presenting problems. At this point, the therapist is identifying what critical pedagogy calls generative themes. In other words, Shanice's description of her history and her current issues will provide reference points for further inquiry and exploration. What will make this woke, however, is that further exploration will be done within an interpretive frame that identifies her problems, past and present, to be the product of unjust, oppressive social forces. A tip-off that this is likely what will come next is if the therapist is a white male. As is often recommended, if not said to be mandatory, a white therapist working with a black client or a person of color should ask how the client feels about working with a white man. If Shanice was to ask why the therapist should ask such a question, this is the opportunity to point out the history of white supremacy and misogynistic patriarchal social power structures, and that the therapist is in a position of privilege. Maybe Shanice will feel something about this, or maybe she'll feel something about the question being asked. An important concept within critical pedagogy is that it differentiates itself as a dialogical approach to education and contrasts itself with what it calls the banking model. This means that the teacher is not an expert who deposits knowledge into the student. Instead, they are to engage in a dialogue where teacher and student, taboo words, are co-learners. The student is assumed to have their own knowledge. This is called various things like lived experience, standpoint, and standpoint epistemology. The dialogue they engage in is a way for the therapist to data mine for generative themes that come out of the client's report of their lived experience. So far, so good. However, the implied explanatory frame of the therapist's leading questions and the suggestions the therapist makes along the way reveal a stealth deposit of critical social justice ideology is taking place. The therapist is only posing as a non-expert, all the while believing that they are an expert whose job it is to awaken the same critical view in the client. The difference is that rather than explicitly and didactically teaching this view, the therapist leads the client to it through dialogue. Critical pedagogy talks about coding and decoding. For therapy, the assessment is a form of coding. It uses language to name and describe the client's history in terms of events, circumstances, and experiences, as well as current problems, dilemmas, and distress. The decoding comes in subsequent sessions where these things that have been coded or explored to identify social power structures and norms that are the real cause of the client's problems. For Shanice, work-related stress can be interpreted as the product of both racial prejudice and gender inequality due to male privilege and misogyny. Frustration about her career advancement could be likewise attributed. Conflict with her husband might be attributed to toxic masculinity, or if they argue because he wants to start a family and she's having reservations because she wants to prioritize her career, this might be interpreted as an oppressive patriarchal expectation that women should have children. Shanice's low mood will likely be understood as the cumulative impact of all of these oppressive forces. The penultimate next step or stage in critical pedagogy praxis, both in education and psychotherapy, is the awakening of critical consciousness. Through dialogue on generative themes and decoding, the client emerges with a sensitivity to and an ability to read the world for all signs of oppressive power. The world of microaggressions and macro-systemic oppression is revealed. This is the meaning of woke. Along with critical consciousness comes a new dimension of distress. Whereas one's issues and problems themselves were the source of distress, now the recognition that one is a victim within unjust power structures is the new source of distress. This is also called productive discomfort, and it's intentionally provoked in the student or the therapy client. The core of the new distress or productive discomfort is anger and resentment. This emotional charge provides the motivation for taking critical pedagogy to its ultimate conclusion, a call to action in the name of revolutionary activism. At this final stage, Shanice's therapist might encourage her to become active with a Black, Indigenous, and people of color group for nurses, BIPOC, B-I-P-O-C. She might also join a feminist group and become an activist against the patriarchy. Or else she might simply be encouraged to be more outspoken in her personal and professional life about the injustices of these power structures and advocate more effectively for herself in these terms. Along with this, the process of a therapy informed by the praxis of critical pedagogy will have strengthened her sense of identity, belonging, and solidarity within marginalized groups. Having laid out the basics, I need to say a few things. First of all, traditional therapies have their own ways of identifying generative themes, doing data mining, coding and decoding, and moving clients toward insights that correspond to the therapist's model for what causes human distress. This is not entirely different from critical consciousness. It's a different set of explanations, but still something the therapist hopes the client will arrive at. For instance, it may be that this insight reveals that the client's problems are attributable to parental failures. This, like critical consciousness, can evoke anger and resentment. The difference is that traditional therapies are more focused on the unique histories and current constellations of problems of individuals. Clients are not reduced to avatars of identity categories and correspondingly presumed to be either oppressed or oppressing. There is more exploration of unique intrapsychic processes and behavioral patterns that may cause, perpetuate, or exacerbate the client's distress and problems. With this comes a sense of agency, of an internal locus of control. The aim is resilience and self-regulation, not blaming and changing the world. It also needs to be said that increasingly people have become already woke. It's pervaded our culture so much that students and psychotherapy clients come already primed for critical pedagogy praxis, even if they've never heard of it explicitly described. They already have critical consciousness. In this case, the woke therapist simply validates and reinforces this. Finally, it needs to be said that any open inquiry into a client's history and the nature of their current issues can and should include the possibility that they've experienced social injustices. To question woke psychotherapy's use of critical pedagogy does not mean to dismiss it altogether. It does mean that the therapist should be discerning about when and to what degree it is an additional useful perspective, and not automatically and dogmatically put it in the driver's seat of therapy. Therapy should be about the client's healing, not about social change. When clients are encouraged to see themselves as victims for the purpose of rousing anger and resentment that can be harnessed for social activism, therapy has ceased to be therapy. Rather than fostering resilience, it perpetuates a victim identity. Thanks for staying with me to the end. I hope you'll return either to check out my earlier videos or to watch a new one. In the meantime, take care of yourself and each other. Bye for now.